In the silence of Montana's unforgiving wilderness, Caleb McRae's calloused hands worked the land while his heart lay buried with memories of love lost. Each night, rain tapped against empty windows, echoing his solitude, until she arrived, unexpected as the first thunderstorm after drought, with a child whose steel-blue eyes mirrored his own. In the small fingers clutching his weathered palm, in whispered conversations by firelight, in courage wrapped in a threadbare shawl, he found what the harsh land had taught him to forget: hope. Some roots don't need to flower to exist. They simply hold fast, weathering every storm. If this journey of broken hearts, finding shelter in each other, speaks to your soul, let your like be the rain that nurtures this story's growth. Comment how you think this story will end. Does love truly heal what time has broken? Your experience matters here. The carriage wheels cut shallow graves into the rust-colored Montana earth as Annabelle Graves approached. The McRae Ranch. The crazy mountains loomed in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with early autumn snow. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and the small bundle in her arms. Little Jude slept against her chest, his breaths warm and shallow, unaware of how their lives might change in the next few moments. The ranch house emerged from behind a stand of aspens, their golden leaves shivering in the wind like anxious whispers. It was larger than she'd expected. Sturdy logs stacked in defiance of winter's coming rage, a broad porch that wrapped around two sides, chimney smoke unfurling in thin ribbons against the gunmetal sky. 3 men stood watching her approach, 2 ranch hands whose faces held the same wary curiosity one might offer a stray dog, and him, Caleb McRae. He stood with his weight shifted to one leg, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, hat tipped low enough that his eyes were shadowed. He was broader than she remembered, his shoulders filling out the worn denim jacket. The years had carved deeper lines around his mouth, but the stubborn set of his jaw was unmistakable. Annabelle's heart fluttered against her ribs like a captured bird. In Abilene 5 years ago, that same jawline had traced paths against her neck in the darkness of a rented room above the saloon. Now it was clenched tight, betraying nothing. "Miss," he said, as she pulled the carriage to a stop. Not a question, not a greeting, a simple acknowledgement. "Mr. McRae." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I've come about the cook position." His eyes flickered to the bundle in her arms, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, like watching stone crack under pressure. "I wasn't expecting," he cleared his throat. "A woman with a child." The advertisement didn't specify. She met his gaze directly. "I can cook for 20 men if need be. I can mend, clean, keep accounts, and I keep to myself." Jude stirred, his tiny fist emerging from the bundle of blankets. Annabelle adjusted her hold, and the child's face turned toward Caleb, eyes fluttering open, the same steel blue as the man who stood before them. And there, above his right eyebrow, the small, crescent-shaped birthmark that mirrored Caleb's own. The ranch hands exchanged glances, Caleb's face drained of color. "This is Jude," Annabelle said, her voice firm but without edge. "We met in Abilene 5 years ago. You asked me to dance after 2. Whiskies and a shootout in the saloon. I wrote you 3 letters, never got an answer." The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the packed earth between them. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, the sound carried away by the endless prairie. "I'm not here asking for anything but work," she continued. "I need to feed my son through winter. That's all." Caleb's throat worked. He stepped forward, close enough that she could smell the leather and wood smoke on him. Could see the way his pupils dilated as he studied the child's face. Then he turned abruptly. "The room's round back, small, but it's got a stove." He strode toward the house without looking back. "Supper's at 6. Annabelle released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She gathered the reins, aware of the ranch hands still watching, their faces unreadable. Above them, a hawk circled in the vast Montana sky, patient and solitary. She had expected to be turned away, had prepared herself for it. Instead, she found herself crossing a threshold she hadn't known existed, into a life that felt both foreign and strangely inevitable, like a river finding its old bed after the floodwaters recede. The back room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and the promised iron stove. A window faced east, where dawn would spill its first light. Annabel set Jude on the bed, watching as he explored the new surroundings with curious fingers, then began unpacking her meager belongings: 2 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush with several missing teeth, a small wooden box containing her mother's thimble, and a lock of Jude's baby hair. At the bottom of her trunk lay a book of poetry, Wordsworth, pages dog-eared and worn, and the silver pendant her grandmother had pressed into her palm before she left Virginia. "For courage," the old woman had whispered. Annabel touched it now, feeling the engraved swirls beneath her fingertips, then slipped it around her neck and tucked it beneath her collar. She had just changed Jude into fresh clothes when a knock sounded at the door. A woman with iron-grey hair and hands gnarled like ancient tree roots stood there, her expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "Mrs. Henley, I do the cooking till now," she said without preamble. "Mr. McRae says you're taking over tomorrow. Kitchen's there." She jerked her head toward the main house. "Pantry's stocked for winter. Men like meat and potatoes. Nothing fancy. They're not particular long as there's plenty." Annabel nodded. "Thank you for showing me." The woman's eyes drifted to Jude, who had climbed down from the bed and was now clutching Annabel's skirts. "That his?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a fish hook. "My son," Annabel replied simply. Mrs. Henley's mouth twisted. "Town's gonna talk." Towns always do. Something like reluctant respect flickered across the older woman's features. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small jar, blackberry preserves, for the boy. She set it on the dresser and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Men take their coffee at dawn. Don't be late." When she was gone, Annabel sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. Jude climbed into her lap, his small hands patting her cheeks as if sensing her weariness. "We'll be all right," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "We made it this far." Through the walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of men's voices, the clink of dishes, boot heels on wooden floors. Outside, the wind whispered through the aspens, and somewhere a door creaked on its hinges, opening and closing, like the beating of an uncertain heart. By the 3rd week, Annabel's hands had memorized the contours of the kitchen, the drawer that stuck unless pulled at just the right angle, the sweet spot on the stove that heated fastest, the crack in the rolling pin's handle that caught at her palm when she made biscuits before dawn. She rose each morning when the sky was still ink-dark, kindled the fire, set coffee to boil, and mixed dough by the lamplight that cast her elongated shadow against the wall. The men filed in at first light, nodding their thanks as she filled their cups, their plates. Some, like Hank Tillman, whose eyes lingered too long on her, kept their distance. Others, like old Jim with his rheumatic hands, offered small kindnesses: a mended rocking chair for Jude, fresh cream from town, a carved wooden spoon to replace the broken one. Caleb came last each morning when the others had gone to their work. He would sit alone at the table, saying little, watching as she moved around the kitchen with Jude often balanced on her hip. Sometimes she caught him studying the boy's face when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze a complicated tangle of wonder, doubt, and something else she couldn't name. On the 8th day, he had pushed his empty plate away and said, "The storage room off the main hall, I'm clearing it out. For the boy." Annabel had paused, a dish towel suspended in her hands. "That's not necessary. It's too cramped back there for both of you." His eyes met hers briefly before sliding away. "Consider it part of your wages." That afternoon, Annabel found him emptying the small room of dusty crates and tools, his sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle. Jude, who usually clung to her skirts around others, toddled over to inspect a pile of harness buckles on the floor. Caleb froze, watching as the boy picked one up, turning it over in his small hands with a gravity that mirrored his own. "Horse," Jude said, looking up at Caleb with solemn eyes. Caleb crouched down, closing the distance between them. "That's right, boy. For the horses." Later that week, Caleb returned from town with a small wooden horse, its mane and tail made of real horsehair, its body painted dapple gray. He handed it to Jude without ceremony, then turned and walked away before the boy's face could split into a delighted grin. That night, as Jude slept with the wooden horse clutched to his chest, Annabel sat by the window, mending one of Caleb's shirts by the moonlight that spilled across her lap like silver water. Her fingers found a tear near the shoulder, and as she drew the needle through the fabric, she allowed herself to wonder if this tentative peace might hold, if the walls between them might gradually thin like creek ice in spring, revealing the current beneath. The first snowfall came early, dusting the land in crystalline white. With it came a hardening of whispers that had been circulating among the ranch hands and in town. Annabelle felt them like a physical presence, glances that skittered away when she turned, conversations that hushed when she entered a room, the way Hank Tillman's mouth curled when he watched Jude playing with the wooden horse. "Cozying up nice and proper, ain't she?" She overheard him saying to another hand as they stomped snow from their boots on the porch. "Got herself and the bastard under McRae's roof quicker than a cat can lick its whiskers." "Shut your mouth, Tillman," came the reply, old Jim's voice heavy with warning. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. Convenient, ain't it, that birthmark could have made it with boot polish for all we know?" Annabelle's hands stilled over the bread dough she was kneading, flour dusting her forearms like the snow. Outside, she forced herself to breathe, to press and fold, letting the familiar rhythm calm the storm gathering inside her. That evening, as she was putting Jude to bed, she heard the shuffle of boots outside the door. Caleb stood there, his frame filling the doorway, hat in his hands. In the lamplight, his face looked carved from the same wood as the ceiling beams, weathered, solid, bearing the marks of time. "Town was asking after you today," he said. "Reverend's wife wanted to know if you'd be joining the Sunday service." Annabelle tucked the blanket around Jude's sleeping form. "And what did you tell her?" "Said you were needed here." He twisted the brim of his hat between calloused fingers. "But she's welcome to call if she's of a mind to meet you." Annabelle understood the implication. In a town this small, being accepted, or at least tolerated by the women, meant the difference between ostracism and survival. "Tillman's been running his mouth," Caleb continued, his voice lowered. "About the boy." She stiffened. And nothing. It's not his business." He looked past her to where Jude slept. "But people talk. They'll keep talking. I'm used to talk." Caleb nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Sunday. We'll go to town, all three of us." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave, then paused. "Wear your best dress." After he'd gone, Annabelle sat on the edge of the small bed, listening to the wind keening outside the window. It sang of isolation, of judgment, of the thousand small cuts that come from living under others' scrutiny. But beneath that song ran another, fainter but persistent, a melody of possibility, of shelter found in unexpected places. She touched the silver pendant at her throat. "For courage," she whispered to herself, and to the sleeping child beside her. Sunday arrived with bitter cold that stole breath and turned creek water to glass. Annabelle dressed Jude in his warmest clothes and put on her one good dress, navy blue wool with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons marching up the bodice, salvaged from her life before. She pinned her hair up with shaking fingers, conscious of how the style softened her face, making her look younger than her 25 years. The church was a simple white clapboard building, with a modest steeple reaching toward the vast Montana sky. When Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingered at her elbow a moment longer than necessary. She felt the weight of eyes upon them as they walked up the church steps. Caleb in front, Annabelle behind with Jude in her arms. Whispers fluttered through the congregation like starlings. Mrs. Henley, seated in the second row, gave a curt nod. The Reverend's wife, a thin woman with pinched features, assessed Annabelle with narrowed eyes before offering a tight smile. Annabelle felt herself being measured, catalogued, filed away in the town's collective judgment. "McRae's cook," someone murmured. "The boy's the spitting image. Heard she showed up out of nowhere." Caleb guided them to a pew near the back. Throughout the service, he sat stiff-backed beside her, hat on his knee, eyes fixed on the Reverend. Jude, restless, squirmed in Annabelle's lap until Caleb silently handed the boy his pocket watch. Jude turned it over in his small hands, entranced by the gleaming metal, and settled. The gesture did not go unnoticed by the congregation. Afterward, as they stood in the churchyard, the Reverend's wife approached, trailing a group of town women like a comet's tail. "Miss Graves," she said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes sharp as flint. "How good of you to join us. We were all so curious about Mr. McRae's new cook." "Mrs. Caldwell." Annabelle inclined her head. "Thank you for the welcome." The woman's gaze drifted to Jude, who was clutching Annabel's skirts. What a unique child. Those eyes are quite striking. One might almost say familiar. Before Annabel could respond, another woman spoke up, older with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Annabel Graves? From Virginia? Annabel turned, surprised. Yes, Richmond originally. I thought so. I knew your mother, God rest her soul. You have her chin. The woman stepped forward, extending her hand. Martha Simmons, my husband and I run the general store. Your mother was a fine seamstress, helped me with my wedding dress years ago. Something loosened in Annabel's chest. A knot she hadn't realized was there. This unexpected connection to her past, to her mother, felt like a lifeline thrown across dark waters. You must come by the store, Martha continued. I've bolts of fabric that need a good eye, and these old fingers aren't what they used to be. The Reverend's wife's mouth tightened, but Martha had shifted the current. The women began to disperse, some nodding politely to Annabel as they left. On the ride home, as the landscape unfurled in endless white beneath a sapphire sky, Caleb finally spoke. You never mentioned Virginia. You never asked. Annabel kept her eyes on the horizon. There wasn't much to tell. My parents died of fever when I was 17. I went west with my uncle's family, ended up in Abilene when they moved on to California. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the creak of wagon wheels and Jude's soft humming. That night, after Jude was asleep, Caleb came to her door. His face was half in shadow, the lamplight catching only the angle of his jaw, the furrow between his brows. Are you certain, he asked, his voice rough as bark, that he's mine? The question hung in the space between them, heavy with implication. Annabel met his gaze steadily. If he wasn't, I would have chosen another ranch, she said quietly, or another name. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, like ice breaking up on a river. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the creaking silence of the old house. Annabel closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs. In his question she had heard not just doubt, but fear. Fear of being deceived, yes, but also fear of believing, of allowing this unexpected branch to graft onto the tree of his life. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like bones. The heavy ledger thudded onto the kitchen table, dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Caleb stood with his hand still on the leather cover, watching Annabel as she dried the last of the supper dishes. Ranch accounts, he said. Been meaning to sort them before spring cattle sales. Annabel wiped her hands on her apron and approached the table cautiously. The ledger was old, its pages stuffed with receipts, invoices, hastily scribbled notes in different hands. You want me to? You said you can keep accounts. His tone wasn't challenging, just matter of fact. Thought you might take a look. She opened the book, fingers tracing the columns of numbers, the crossed-out calculations, the coffee stains on the margins. It's a mess. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Been through 3 ranch hands who claimed they could cipher. None lasted more than a season. Annabel pulled out a chair and sat down, already absorbed in the puzzle before her. She barely noticed when Caleb placed a lamp closer to her elbow, or when he slipped away to check on Jude, who was playing by the fire with his wooden horse. Hours later, when the house had grown quiet and the fire burned low, she was still at the table, a fresh page open before her, columns neatly reorganized, figures transferred in her careful hand. She had found the discrepancies, small errors that had compounded over time, a pattern of lost profits in the cattle sales, unnecessary expenses that could be trimmed. She didn't hear Caleb return until his shadow fell across the page. You should sleep, he said, his voice soft in the stillness. Annabel looked up, suddenly aware of the crick in her neck, the stiffness in her shoulders. I've nearly finished the first year. I can start on the rest tomorrow. He studied her work, calloused finger tracing the neat rows of figures. You've got a head for numbers. My father taught me. He said a woman who can't manage her own accounts is at the mercy of those who can. Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. Smart man. He was. She closed the ledger gently. You're losing money on the South grazing lands. The fees you're paying to the Hargrove outfit are twice what they should be. Something hardened in his face. Hargrove's been setting prices in this valley since before I came. Man's got half the county in his pocket. He's cheating you. That's so. His voice had an edge now. "And what would you suggest, Mrs. Graves? That I ride over and tell Thomas Hargrove, who sits on the bank board and owns the grain mill, that a woman's figured out his scheme?" Annabel held his gaze. "I would suggest you look for alternative arrangements. There's the Carson property to the east. Their grazing rights are up for renewal in spring." Surprise flickered across his features, quickly masked. "How did you know that?" "Mrs. Carson mentioned it at church. Her son's gone to Denver. They're scaling back." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Caleb's face was unreadable in the dancing light. "I'll think on it," he said finally. When he left, Annabel remained at the table, her hand resting on the closed ledger. She had crossed a boundary tonight, moved from cook to advisor, from employee to something not yet defined. It was a risk, offering her thoughts so boldly. But the ranch's future was now entwined with her own, with Jude's. She had not come all this way to watch it falter under poor management. Through the window she could see the stars scattered across the Montana sky like salt across black velvet. So much emptiness between each point of light, so much darkness. Yet together they formed patterns, constellations, maps by which to navigate. She thought of the silver pendant against her skin, for courage. Tomorrow she would continue with the ledgers, and the next day, and the day after that, each figure a stitch, binding her future to this place, to the man whose footsteps now creaked on the floorboards above. The dream came, as it always did, fragments of memory stitched together by the needle of sleep. Her mother's hands, blue-veined and gentle, guiding her own over. Embroidery hoops, the scent of lemon verbena, the weight of her father's law books as she carried them to his study, then the fever that took them both in a single cruel week, leaving her alone in the big house on Clay Street with its fading grandeur and mounting debts. Her uncle's arrival, his wife's thin-lipped assessment of what remained, the auction, the journey west in the crowded wagon, her cousin's resentment at the extra mouth to feed, Denver, Cheyenne, then Abilene, where her uncle announced they were continuing to California, but she could stay if she found work. She was 18 by then, with her mother's thimble, her father's copy of Wordsworth, and her grandmother's pendant, her only inheritance. The dream shifted. The boarding house where she worked for room and board, the young women who shared her attic room, their faces smudged by time except for Mary, sweet Mary with the laugh like church bells, who convinced her to go to the dance at Holloway's saloon on that fateful night, the gunshot that sent everyone diving for cover, the broken glass, and him, Caleb McRae, offering his hand afterward, his eyes the color of a winter sky, promising nothing but the moment. Annabel woke with a gasp, the dream clinging to her like cobwebs. Outside, dawn was breaking, painting the frost-covered window with pale gold light. Beside her, Jude slept peacefully, one arm flung above his head in unconscious abandon. She touched his cheek gently. In the soft morning light, with his eyes closed, he looked more like her. The curve of his cheek, the fan of his lashes, the small dimple at the corner of his mouth. But when he opened his eyes, he was all Caleb, a single night, a moment of weakness, of loneliness, of seeking warmth in a cold world. She hadn't expected it to reshape her entire life, hadn't expected the seed planted that night to grow into this golden-haired boy who now carried her heart outside her body. She hadn't expected to find herself back in Caleb, McRae's orbit either. Yet here she was, navigating the strange gravity that pulled them together, even as their own stubborn natures kept them apart. Rising quietly so as not to wake Jude, Annabel dressed and made her way to the kitchen to start breakfast. The house was still silent, the men not yet stirring. She kindled the fire, filled the coffee pot, and began mixing biscuit dough, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. When she reached for the flour sack, her hand brushed against something unexpected, a package wrapped in brown paper. She untied the twine carefully, revealing dark blue wool, finer than any she had seen since leaving Virginia, and a pair of small leather boots. A note lay on top, the handwriting blunt and spare. "For winter, for you and the boy." Annabel's throat tightened. She ran her fingers over the wool, imagining the coat she could make from it, warm enough to withstand the Montana winter, fine enough to wear to church without shame. And the boots, for Jude, crafted of supple leather with sheepskin lining, would keep his feet warm through the snow-heavy months ahead. It wasn't the gift itself that undid her, but the thought behind it, the recognition of needs she had never voiced, the acknowledgement, however silent, of their place in his world. When Caleb entered the kitchen an hour later, the men already seated and eating, Annabel handed him his coffee as usual. Their fingers brushed, and she allowed herself to meet his eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, the barest dip of his chin, but his eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary. That evening, as Annabel sat by the fire cutting the blue wool according to the pattern she had sketched, she said, "In the spring I'd like to plant a garden. Nothing large, just herbs, some vegetables, maybe flowers." Caleb looked up from his pipe, surprise evident in the slight raise of his eyebrow. "You planning that far ahead? Aren't you?" she countered softly. "With the cattle, the grazing rights?" Something shifted in his expression, a realization, perhaps, that she was staking a claim not just to soil for planting, but to a future here. "South side gets good sun," he said after a moment. "Ground's rocky, but it can be cleared." Annabel nodded, returning to her cutting. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. But inside, by the fire's glow, seeds of a different sort were taking root, tentative, fragile, but alive with possibility. The blue coat took shape under Annabel's hands, each stitch a promise against winter's bite. She worked on it in the evenings after Jude was asleep and her kitchen duties were done, sometimes aware of Caleb watching her from his chair by the fire, his pipe sending curlicues of smoke toward the ceiling beams. They had fallen into a rhythm these past weeks. Breakfast for the men at dawn, Jude playing nearby as she preserved the last of the fall apples, mended shirts, balanced ledgers. Caleb, coming and going with the ranch's rhythms, checking cattle in the lower pastures, repairing fence lines, making brief trips to town. Their conversations were still sparse, but the silences between them had softened, become comfortable rather than charged. Jude had taken to following Caleb when he worked in the barn, standing solemnly beside him as he repaired tack or sharpened tools. Caleb had begun to acknowledge the boy's presence with small gestures, a nod, a brief explanation of what he was doing, once even hoisting him up to see inside a nest of barn swallows tucked in the rafters. On the day Annabel finished the coat, snow was falling in earnest, blanketing the world in white silence. She held up the completed garment, examining her handiwork, the neat seams, the carefully turned collar, the mother-of-pearl buttons she had salvaged from one of her old dresses. "That's fine work." She turned to find Caleb in the doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, his cheeks ruddy from cold. "It's the wool," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "The quality makes it easy to work with." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the fabric with calloused fingers. "My mother could sew like that. Made all our clothes when I was a boy." It was the first time he had mentioned his family. Annabel held the small revelation carefully, like a bird's egg found in tall grass. "You never speak of them. Your family." Caleb's hand dropped away from the coat. "Not much to tell. Father was a hard man. Mother died young. Left home at 16, worked ranches from Texas to Wyoming before settling here. No siblings? A brother. Lost track of him after the war." His voice held no invitation for further questions. Annabel folded the coat carefully. "I'll wear it to church on Sunday." Something like satisfaction crossed his features before he nodded and turned away. But at the door, he paused. Found the boy looking at Dusty today. Old horse seemed to take to him. "Jude loves animals. Thought I might put him up on the saddle, just in the corral if you're agreeable." The offer hung between them, not just permission to teach Jude about horses, but an acknowledgement of shared authority over the boy's upbringing. "I'd be obliged," she said softly. That Sunday, when Annabel walked into church wearing the blue coat, heads turned. The rich fabric and careful tailoring spoke of care, of provision, of belonging. Beside her, Caleb stood straighter, his hat in his hands, Jude between. Them in his new boots. They were no longer simply McRae and his cook with her fatherless child. They were something the town could recognize, could categorize, a household, if not yet a family. Martha Simmons approached after the service, her eyes warm with approval. "That coat suits you beautifully, Annabel, such fine stitching." "Thank you." Annabel touched the sleeve self-consciously. The wool was a gift. Martha's gaze flickered to Caleb, who was speaking with the blacksmith a few yards away. "A thoughtful one," she observed. Then, lowering her voice, "The sewing circle meets Tuesdays at my home. You'd be welcome. Inclusion. Acceptance. the currency of survival in a place like this. Annabel felt something ease in her chest, a tightness she had carried since arriving. "I'd like that," she said. On the ride home, fat snowflakes drifted down from a pearl-grey sky. Jude, bundled between them on the wagon seat, tilted his face up in wonder, trying to catch them on his tongue. Caleb reached over and adjusted the boy's scarf, tucking it more securely around his neck. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but Annabel felt its significance like a physical weight, the gentle press of possibility. That night she dreamed not of the past, but of spring, of turning soil with her hands, of green things pushing up through dark earth, of roots taking hold beneath the surface, invisible but essential. January brought bitter cold that seeped through every crack in the old ranch house. The men spent their days breaking ice on the stock tanks, distributing hay to the cattle huddled in the sheltered valleys, repairing equipment in the relative warmth of the barn. Evenings found them gathered in the kitchen, drawn by the heat of the stove and the promise of hot food. Annabel moved among them with quiet efficiency, refilling coffee cups, serving stew and biscuits, occasionally joining in their subdued conversation. She had become a fixture in their lives, no longer an intruder but a presence as necessary as the fire on the hearth. Jude, too, had carved out his place. The men had taken to bringing him small treasures, a hawk feather, a peculiarly shaped stone, an arrowhead found near the creek bed. Old Jim had whittled him a set of wooden animals that now populated the floor beneath the kitchen table, where Jude conducted elaborate scenarios understood only to himself. Hank Tillman alone maintained his distance, though his open hostility had faded to grudging tolerance. Annabel often felt his eyes on her, assessing, calculating, but she no longer feared his judgment. Her place here had been established, not yet defined, but secure enough to weather his suspicion. One evening, after the men had retired to the bunkhouse and Jude was asleep in his room, now furnished with a proper bed, a small chair, and shelves for his growing collection of treasures, Annabel sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers. Caleb's chair scraped against the floorboards as he pulled it closer to the stove, pipe in hand. "Carson agreed to the grazing arrangement," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Starting spring. Said his wife spoke highly of you." Annabel looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Carson hardly knows me." "Knows enough, apparently." He tamped tobacco into his pipe, not meeting her eyes. "Town's opinion of you has shifted." "Has it?" "Martha Simmons says you've got the finest hand with a needle she's seen in years." Reverend's wife admitted those preserves you sent were better than her own. A hint of pride colored his voice. "And the hands respect you. Even Tillman's kept his mouth shut these past weeks." Annabel set down her pencil, warmed by his words but uncertain of their purpose. "I'm glad to have proven useful." Caleb struck a match, the flare illuminating the planes of his face, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he wasn't scowling. "It's more than that." He fell silent then, focusing on his pipe, drawing the flame into the tobacco. Annabel waited, sensing he had more to say but wouldn't be rushed. Finally he spoke again. "Been thinking about the boy, about you." Her heart quickened. "Oh? This arrangement we have, it's not—" He frowned, searching for words. "It's not right." Cold dread pooled in Annabel's stomach. "If you're dissatisfied with my work—" "No." He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "That's not what I mean." "Then what?" He set the pipe down, leaning forward, with his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the glowing stove door. "You're not a cook, Annabel, not just a cook. You keep the books better than any banker. You've saved this ranch money, made it run smoother. The men listen to you. Jude, he's—" A pause. "He's my son, our son, and you." He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly. "You shouldn't be sleeping in the back room, or working for wages in your own home." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Annabel's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "What are you saying, Caleb?" He stood abruptly, moving to the window where frost patterns crept across the glass like delicate ferns. "I'm saying you don't need to be the cook here anymore. I want you to be my wife." The proposal, for that's what it was despite its bluntness, stole her breath. Not because it was unexpected, exactly. The current had been pulling them in this direction for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, breathtakingly real. Rose moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the moon cast blue shadows on the snow, and the stars pierced the black sky like pinpricks in velvet. "Why?" she asked softly. He turned to her, brows drawn together. "Why what? Why do you want to marry me? Is it for Jude? For propriety's sake? Or is it for the books and the cooking and the mending?" The questions weren't accusatory, simply direct, as he had been with her. Caleb studied her face in the lamplight. "All of that," he admitted. "And none of it." He reached out, hesitated, then lightly touched the sleeve of her dress, the same blue as the coat he had given her. "I sleep better knowing you're under this roof. I find myself thinking of things to tell you during the day. The sound of your voice in this kitchen, it makes this house feel like more than shelter." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even particularly romantic, but it was honest, and in its honesty, more meaningful than flowery declarations could have been. Annabel took a deep breath. "I have conditions." His eyebrow quirked up, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Do you now?" "I keep doing the books, and I want my garden come spring." She met his gaze steadily. "And I won't be just your wife, Caleb. I'll be your partner. In all things." He considered her words, then nodded slowly. "Seems fair." "Then yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you." Relief and something like joy softened his features. He reached for her hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that surprised them both with its tenderness. Outside, the wind picked up, singing through the eaves of the old house, but its keening seemed less lonely now, more like a wild, joyful chorus welcoming a new beginning. They were married on a Tuesday in February, when a brief thaw turned the snow to slush and the sun emerged from weeks of grey concealment. The Reverend came to the ranch, his wife in tow, along with Martha Simmons and her husband, old Jim as witness, and the rest of the ranch hands who stood awkwardly in their clean shirts and dampened down hair. Annabel wore her blue coat over a dress Martha had helped her make, cream-coloured wool with a lace collar salvaged from her mother's wedding gown, the only piece she had kept. In her hair she wore sprigs of dried lavender from Martha's garden. Around her neck her grandmother's pendant caught the light. Caleb had shaved for the occasion, his jaw smooth for the first time since she had known him. He wore a black coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and an expression of solemn intensity as he repeated the vows. Jude, scrubbed pink and dressed in his best clothes, stood between them, occasionally reaching up to touch the Reverend's Bible with curious fingers. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend declared, closing his Bible with a sense of finality. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." There was no passionate kiss, no dramatic embrace. Caleb simply took Annabel's hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture both possessive and gentle. Martha had baked a cake, and Mrs. Henley, who had returned for the occasion, served coffee and whiskey while the men shuffled their feet and offered gruff congratulations. The Reverend's wife presented Annabel with a handmade quilt, her earlier suspicion apparently resolved. "Every bride needs a marriage bed," she said, her thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. By evening, when the guests had gone and Jude was asleep in his room, Annabel found herself standing in Caleb's bedroom, now their bedroom, feeling suddenly, acutely uncertain. The quilt was spread across the large bed, its pattern of interlocking rings seeming to mock her nervousness. Caleb entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He had removed his formal coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, more closely resembling the man she had come to know over these past months. "You don't have to," he began, then cleared his throat. "We can wait, if you're not ready." Annabel turned to him, touched by his consideration. "We've done this before, Caleb," she reminded him gently. "The result is sleeping down the hall." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That was different. We were strangers then. And now?" He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers. "Now, you're my wife, the mother of my son, the keeper of my home and my books and my heart. Though I didn't intend to give you the latter." The confession, so simply stated, unlocked something in Annabel's chest. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his lower lip. "I didn't intend to give you mine either," she whispered. "Yet here we are." When he kissed her, it wasn't with the desperate hunger of their first encounter years ago in Abilene. It was slower, deeper, weighted with knowledge and choice rather than impulse. His hands, when they came to rest at her waist, were both familiar and new, known in their strength but novel in their tenderness. Later, as moonlight spilled across the quilt and their entwined forms beneath it, Annabel felt the last walls between them dissolve. In the quiet aftermath, with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she allowed herself to believe in this unlikely home they had built, a shelter constructed of circumstance, necessity, and now something that might be called love. Spring arrived in fits and starts, warm winds followed by sudden frosts, green shoots appearing only to be buried under late snow. But by April, the transformation was undeniable. The land softened, creeks swelled with melting runoff, and birds returned to build nests in the eaves and aspens. Life at the ranch shifted too, settling into new patterns. Annabel moved through the house now not as an employee, but as its mistress, her authority no longer questioned. She still cooked. They hadn't yet found someone to replace her in that role, but she did so now as part of her broader responsibility to the household, not as her primary function. The men came to her with minor injuries, torn clothing, news from town. She kept the books with increasing confidence, suggesting improvements, identifying opportunities. Caleb consulted her before making decisions, not just about household matters, but about the ranch's operations. They didn't always agree, but their disagreements had the flavor of partnership rather than conflict. And Jude blossomed like the wildflowers that now dotted the hillsides. He followed Caleb everywhere, soaking up knowledge about horses, cattle, the rhythms of ranch life. He called him Pa now, the word falling from his lips as naturally as breath. At night, Caleb would read to him from an old book of tall tales, the boy curled against his side, eyes wide with wonder. On a mild day in late April, Caleb helped Annabel clear the plot for her garden, turning the rocky soil, adding manure from the stables, building a low fence to keep out rabbits and deer. Jude helped by collecting stones in his small wheelbarrow, occasionally stopping to examine an earthworm or beetle with intense concentration. "What will you plant first?" Caleb asked, leaning on his shovel, sweat dampening his shirt despite the cool breeze. Annabel knelt in the freshly turned earth, her hands testing its consistency. Herbs near the house, thyme, rosemary, sage, vegetables beyond, carrots, peas, beans. And there, she pointed to the far corner of the plot, flowers, hollyhocks against the fence perhaps, marigolds to keep the bugs away from the vegetables. Practical, he observed with a slight smile. Beauty can be practical, she countered. It feeds a different kind of hunger. He considered this, then nodded. My mother used to say something similar. She planted sunflowers along the west side of our cabin, said they reminded her that even in hard country there's room for joy. These glimpses into his past were still rare, offered sparingly like water in drought. Annabel treasured each one, adding them to her understanding of the man she had married. That night, after Jude was asleep, they sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Caleb's arm rested along the back of the bench, not quite touching her shoulders but present, protective. "I received a letter today," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From the bank in Billings." Annabel turned to him, concern tightening her chest. "Is something wrong with the loan?" "No, it's about my application to purchase the east section, the Carson land." She had helped him prepare that application weeks ago, carefully detailing the ranch's improved financial position, projecting future growth. And approved. A smile ghosted across his lips. "We can close the deal next month." "Caleb, that's wonderful." She laid her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "Sleeve, that water access alone will make a huge difference for the herd. It was your idea," he reminded her. "Your figures that convinced them." "Our idea," she corrected gently. "Our figures." He covered her hand with his own, his wedding band gleaming dully in the fading light. "Our land." The word hung between them, weighted with significance beyond its simple sound. Our. A joining, a sharing, a future built with 4 hands instead of 2. Later, in the darkness of their bedroom, with only the sound of their breathing and the distant howl of a coyote, Annabel whispered, "I never thought I'd have this again. A home." Caleb's hand found hers beneath the quilt. "What was it like? Your home in Virginia?" She told him then, about the house on Clay Street with its creaking floors and tall windows, the garden where her mother grew roses, the study where her father's law books lined the walls. She spoke of Sunday dinners and summer thunderstorms viewed from the wide porch, of Christmas mornings and her mother's birthday cakes decorated with candied violets. "I lost it all so quickly," she said, her voice catching. "The fever took them within days of each other. Then the creditors came. Turns out my father had debts I never knew about. Everything was sold, the furniture, the books, even my mother's silver. Except the pendant," Caleb noted, his fingers finding it where it rested in the hollow of her throat. "My grandmother gave it to me on her deathbed. Said it was too precious to risk to creditors." Annabel touched it reflexively. "She said it would give me courage when I needed it most." "Did it?" She turned to face him in the darkness, able to make out only the silhouette of his profile against the pale square of the window. "Yes, when I came here, when I showed you Jude." His arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer. "That took courage indeed." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I couldn't bear the thought of him never knowing you. Of you never knowing him." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his breathing steady against her hair. Then so quietly she almost missed it. "Thank you." 2 simple words, yet in them lay volumes. Gratitude not just for Jude, but for the life they were building, for the second chance neither had expected to find. Outside, spring winds sighed through the aspens, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the moonlight. Inside, in the warmth of their shared bed, seeds planted months ago continued to grow, invisible, essential, transforming what had once been separate and solitary into something intertwined and stronger for it. Summer arrived with merciless heat and cloudless skies. Weeks passed without rain, turning the lush spring grass brittle and brown. Creeks shrank to trickles, then to damp depressions in the earth. Dust devils danced across the parched land, and the sun hung in the sky like a molten coin, relentless and unforgiving. Annabel's garden survived only through daily watering, carried bucket by bucket from the well that, thankfully, remained strong. The vegetables grew stunted but persistent. The herbs thrived despite the heat, their scent intensifying in the dry air. The hollyhocks drooped by midday but rallied each morning, their stubborn blooms a testament to hope in difficult seasons. But the ranch suffered. Caleb and the men drove the cattle daily to the remaining water sources, watching anxiously as the stock grew thinner, their ribs increasingly visible beneath dull hides. The new Carson land with its year-round spring proved invaluable, but even that water source was diminishing. Annabel heard the worry in the men's voices each evening, saw it in the tightness around Caleb's eyes, felt it in the growing tension that filled the house like another presence. "Hargrove's offering to buy out struggling ranches," Caleb said one night as they sat on the porch, seeking relief from the stuffy heat indoors. "Carson, Johnson, Wilkes, all considering his offers." Annabel's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "For how much?" "Half what they're worth, but with no rain." He shook his head. "Cash in hand looks mighty appealing when your cattle are dying and your land's turning to dust." "Has he approached you?" "Not yet, but he will." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's wanted this valley since before I settled here. This drought is an opportunity he won't ignore." Annabel set her sewing aside. "We're not in the same position as the others. Our finances are sound. The well is holding. And the Carson spring won't last forever without rain." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as frustration. "If this continues into fall..." She moved to sit beside him, her shoulder touching his. "What would you do if he made an offer?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains where thunderheads gathered each afternoon, promising rain that never reached the valley. "This land," he said finally, his voice low, "is all I've built, all I have to give Jude, to give you." "It's not all," Annabel countered softly. "We have each other. We have skills. We could start again somewhere else if we had to." He turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "You'd leave, after putting down roots here?" She took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength in his fingers. "Roots can be transplanted, Caleb. They may falter for a season, but they can grow. Again in new soil." Something in his posture eased slightly. "You sound very sure." "I've done it before," she reminded him with a small smile. "But I'm not saying we should give up, only that our home isn't just this land or this house. It's us. You, me, Jude. Whatever comes, we face it together." Caleb's hand tightened around hers. In the dying light, his profile was etched against the darkening sky, strong, stubborn, but no longer alone. The next morning, Hank Tillman rode in from the south. Range, his horse lathered despite the early hour. "Fire," he announced grimly as he dismounted. "Lightning strike in the dry timber, winds pushing it north." The news galvanized the ranch into action. Caleb organized the men into groups, some to dig fire breaks, others to move cattle to safety, still others to wet down the buildings should the fire reach the ranch house. Annabelle worked alongside Martha Simmons and other women from neighboring ranches who had come to help, preparing food and water for the firefighters, packing valuables in case evacuation became necessary, tending to minor burns and smoke inhalation. For 3 days, the sky was orange with smoke, the air acrid and thick. Ash fell like grey snow, coating everything. Jude stayed close to Annabelle. His eyes wide with fear, she tried to soothe, though her own heart raced with dread. On the 4th day, when hope was wearing thin and exhaustion had settled into every muscle, the wind shifted, and with it came rain, not the gentle showers of spring, but a violent downpour that turned dust to mud in minutes and transformed dry creek beds into rushing torrents. Caleb returned to the house soaked to the skin, his face streaked with soot and fatigue, but his eyes alight with relief. "It's out," he announced to the gathered women and children. "Fire's out." Rain came just in time. A cheer went up, and Jude broke free from Annabelle's side to run to his father. Caleb scooped him up, heedless of his filthy clothes, and held him close. Over the boy's head, his eyes found Annabelle's. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words, a recognition of what truly mattered. Later, when the celebration had quieted and the ranch hands had returned to their bunkhouse, Annabelle and Caleb stood at the bedroom window, watching the rain continue to fall in silvery sheets. "We could have lost everything," he said quietly. Annabelle leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "But we didn't." "No," he agreed, his arm circling her waist. "We didn't." The drought had broken, but it had left its mark, not just on the land, which would recover with time, but on them. They had been tested and had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, their bonds strengthened by the shared crucible of fear and hope. Outside, the parched earth drank deeply, the rain washing away ash and despair, promising renewal. Inside, Annabelle rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and knew that whatever seasons lay ahead, harsh or gentle, dry or abundant, they would weather them together. Autumn painted the valley in russet and gold, the aspens shimmering like coins in the clear light. After the rain, the land had rallied with astonishing vigor, grass growing tall enough to bend in the wind, creeks running full and clear, wildflowers emerging in a last defiant bloom before frost. The cattle had recovered their strength, growing sleek on the renewed pastures. The garden had yielded a modest but satisfying harvest. Carrots sweet from the cold nights, pumpkins heavy on their vines, herbs dried and hanging in fragrant bunches from the kitchen rafters. Annabelle stood at the edge of the garden, now mostly cleared for winter, a basket of late tomatoes on her arm. 3 years had passed since she had arrived at the ranch, a desperate woman with a child and few options. Now she surveyed the land, their land, with the quiet satisfaction of one who has both found and created home. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Caleb was returning from town, Jude perched in front of him on the saddle. At 5, the boy was all long limbs and endless questions, his face alight with the same intense curiosity she remembered from her own father. They made a striking pair, father and son, dark and fair, both with the same steel-blue eyes and set to their jaws. Something caught in Annabelle's throat at the sight of them, a sweetness that bordered on pain. "Ma," Jude called, waving frantically as they approached. "Pa let me steer the whole way back from the creek." "Did he now?" Annabelle set down her basket as Caleb reined in beside her. "And did you keep him on the road, or did you try to chase rabbits again?" Jude's guilty grin told her all she needed to know. Caleb lifted him down from the saddle, his own expression a mixture of pride and amusement. "Boy's a natural horseman," he declared, ruffling Jude's hair. "Got a letter for you," he added, reaching into his coat pocket. "From Virginia." Annabelle took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "It's from Charlotte, my cousin." She opened it carefully, scanning the contents. She's coming west, to Denver with her husband, wants to see me. Denver's a fair journey, Caleb observed, watching her face closely. She's the only family I have left, Annabelle said quietly. Besides you and Jude. Caleb nodded, understanding. We could go. After the fall cattle sale, take the train, make a proper trip of it. Annabelle looked up, surprised by his ready agreement. You'd leave the ranch? In winter? Jim can manage for a few weeks. He dismounted, leading his horse toward the barn. Might do us good to see something beyond these mountains. That night, after Jude was asleep, Annabelle sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen, composing her reply to Charlotte. Caleb entered quietly, setting a small wooden box before her. What's this? She asked, looking up from her letter. Something I've been holding on to for the right time. He nudged the box closer. Open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a pair of earrings, small sapphires set in silver, their blue depths catching the lamplight. Caleb, she breathed, touching one gently. They're beautiful, but the expense. They were my mother's, he interrupted. Only thing of hers I kept. Been in a bank box in Billings all these years. He shifted, uncharacteristically hesitant. Thought you might wear them when we go to Denver. Annabelle lifted the earrings carefully, feeling their weight. Not just the physical heft of silver and stone, but the significance of what they represented. Family, heritage, the passing of precious things from one generation to the next. I'd be honored, she said softly. Caleb nodded, satisfied. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. What will you tell your cousin? About us? Annabelle considered the question. The truth. That I came here desperate and found more than I dared hope for. That you're a good father to Jude. A good husband to me. Am I? The question held no insecurity, only genuine curiosity. She turned to him, studying the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, the lines etched by sun and wind, the steady gaze that could still make her heart quicken after all this time. Better than I deserve, perhaps. He shook his head, rejecting this. You brought life back to this place, Annabelle, to me. His hand found hers on the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. Now, she prompted when he fell silent. Now I have something worth building, worth fighting for. His eyes held hers, intense and certain. You and Jude, you're my home, more than this land or this house ever was. The declaration, so simply stated yet so profound, filled Annabelle with a warmth that spread from her center outward. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. And you are ours, she whispered. Outside, the first frost of the season painted the windows with delicate patterns, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Annabelle felt the full harvest of what they had sown together, not just the tangible bounty of garden and ranch, but the richer yield of trust, of commitment, of love. Grown slowly but deeply, like the roots of the aspens that anchored the valley against wind and storm. The train journey to Denver took 3 days, a voyage through changing landscapes that left Jude pressed to the window for hours, his excitement undiminished by the monotony that occasionally settled over his parents. For Annabelle, watching the land transform from Montana's rugged beauty to the sweeping plains and finally to the foothills of Colorado was like paging through chapters of her own life. The journey west she had made as a girl, the years of searching for place and purpose, the return now as a woman secure in her identity. She wore Caleb's mother's earrings, their weight a pleasant reminder against her neck when she turned her head. Caleb noticed her touching them occasionally and would smile. A private communication in the crowded train car. Charlotte met them at the station in Denver, her familiar face older, but still bearing the same dimpled smile Annabelle remembered from childhood. She embraced her cousin with tears, then stepped back to take in the tall, serious man and the fair-haired boy who stood protectively close to his mother. "So, this is your family," Charlotte said, her voice warm with approval. "Jude, you look just like your father." The boy beamed at this, reaching for Caleb's hand. "Pa's teaching me to rope calves," he announced proudly, "and I can ride Dusty all by myself now." "A proper cowboy," Charlotte laughed, then turned to Caleb. "Thank you for bringing them all this way. It means more than I can say to see Annabelle again." Caleb tipped his hat, his usual reserve softened by genuine goodwill. "The pleasure is ours, ma'am." The week that followed was a bridge between Annabelle's past and present. Walks through Denver with Charlotte, reminiscing about their childhood in Virginia, while Jude skipped ahead and Caleb listened quietly. Dinners with Charlotte's husband, a kind-eyed banker who treated Caleb with easy respect. An afternoon at the theater where Jude sat wide-eyed at his first play. Evenings by the fire in Charlotte's comfortable home, sharing stories of the years that had separated them. On their last night in Denver, after Jude had been tucked into bed in the guest room, Charlotte presented Annabelle with a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I saved a few things," she explained, as Annabelle unwrapped it, "after the auction. Things I thought you might want someday." Inside lay a lace handkerchief embroidered with her mother's initials, a small watercolor her father had painted of their Richmond garden, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, her mother solemn-faced but beautiful, her father standing proud beside her. "Charlotte," Annabelle whispered, tears blurring her vision, "I never thought I'd see their faces again." Caleb, sensing the moment's intimacy, quietly excused himself to check on Jude. Charlotte took Annabelle's hand. "You've done well for yourself, Belle," she said, softly. "I worried after you stayed behind in Abilene. When your letters stopped coming, I feared the worst." "There were dark times," Annabelle admitted, "after Jude was born, before I found Caleb again. But you survived. You thrived." Charlotte's eyes were bright with admiration. "Look at you now, a ranch owner's wife, a mother, respected in your community. Your parents would be so proud." Annabelle traced her mother's face in the daguerreotype. "Do you think so? Even with how unconventional it all was?" "They valued courage above all else," Charlotte reminded her, "and you, cousin, have that in abundance." Later, lying beside Caleb in the unfamiliar bed, Annabelle shared Charlotte's words, along with her own lingering doubts. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what might have happened if I hadn't come to the ranch that day? If I'd gone elsewhere?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his breathing steady in the darkness. "I used to believe that life was just a series of accidents," he said finally. "Good luck, bad luck, coincidence. Now I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" He shifted to face her, his hand finding her cheek. "Maybe some things are meant to be, not in a way that takes away our choices, but in a way that leads us back to where we belong, like a river finding its way to the sea no matter how many bends and turns it takes." The poetry of his words, so unexpected from this usually taciturn man, brought fresh tears to Annabelle's eyes. "And we belong together? You believe that?" "I do." His voice was firm, certain. "You, me, Jude. The ranch. It's not perfect, but it's right." She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "It's more than right," she whispered. "It's home." 2 days later, as the train carried them back toward Montana, Annabelle watched the landscape gradually transform back to the rugged beauty she had come to love. Jude slept with his head in her lap, exhausted from the excitement of their journey. Across from them, Caleb read a newspaper, occasionally looking up to meet her eyes with a small smile. Annabelle touched the daguerreotype in her pocket, then the sapphire earrings at her ears, past and present, tangibly connected. She thought of the ranch waiting for them, of the spring garden she would plant, of Jude growing taller and stronger with each passing season, of the years stretching ahead with their inevitable joys and sorrows, all to be weathered together. The key. Train rounded a bend, and suddenly the crazy mountains appeared in the distance, their peaks sharp against the vast Montana sky. Annabelle felt a surge of recognition, of belonging, that caught her by surprise with its intensity. Caleb, noting her expression, set aside his newspaper. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said, then corrected herself. "Everything. Just coming home." He reached across to take her hand, his grip warm and solid. No words were needed. In the comfortable silence between them lay all they had built together. Trust formed slowly like sedimentary rock, layer upon layer. Love grown not in dramatic gestures, but in daily choices to remain, to work, to believe in something larger than individual survival. As the train carried them ever closer to the ranch, Annabelle thought of the aspen grove near their house, how each tree appeared separate, but was in fact connected by an intricate root system beneath the soil, drawing strength from the same source, weathering storms. Together, persisting through drought and freeze, through fire and flood. Like those aspens, she and Caleb and Jude had formed something resilient and interdependent, visible in their daily life together, but rooted in something deeper, something that could not be seen but only felt, something that would endure long after they were gone, in the land they tended, in the child they raised, in the stories that would be told of them. Roots, deep roots, which did not need to flower to exist, but which, quietly, steadily, held fast to the earth and to each other, season after season, year after year, gathering strength from the very challenges that threatened to uproot them. Annabel squeezed Caleb's hand, and he returned the pressure, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to cherish. Outside the window, Montana unfurled in endless waves of grassland and sky, calling them home.